How's it going, everyone? My name's Dylan, or Tie-Dye here on YouTube, and welcome back. It has been a very long time since my last tutorial video, but I'm finished up school, I'm back at it, so slowly but surely I'm going to be trickling in more and more videos onto this channel, starting off with a bit of a larger overview tutorial. One of my buddies who I worked with over at Decagon, a guy named Chris, super awesome guy, requested for me to sort of do some basic introduction stuff in Unreal. So we're going to be covering a lot of pretty surface level stuff, but I would probably title something like this along the lines of like an intro to art for Unreal Engine. So we're going to cover a bunch of different stuff. I'm going to have a lot of timestamps in the description to sort of let you guys have easy access to the material that you want. But just as a super quick overview, the stuff that we're going to be covering here are unique props, so how to export assets from whatever 3D software package you have, and if it has one UV set, how to sort of apply materials to that and get that all working up in Engine. Then we're going to sort of take it a bit of a step further with building, so we're going to be doing a little bit of a dive into how to export assets with multiple texture sets, assets that are perhaps using trim sheets, how to scale UVs within Engine and sort of have tiling stuff appear bigger or smaller depending on what we're working with. I'm going to bring up a couple other cool stuff sort of revolving around that as well when we get there. I'm also going to dive into landscape, so just very basic tools using the landscape creation in Unreal, as well as how to do some vertex painting, so that's sort of mixing two different materials together. We're going to be doing that as both just a normal version and one that's based on the height map. So that's super powerful stuff that we're going to be covering. And then to top it all off, we're going to have a very basic introduction to the lighting and how that whole system works within Unreal. So a lot to cover. Like I said, though, we're going to be keeping timestamps in the description. And I'm also going to be trying to include as many other tutorials or articles or things that relate to what I'm talking to in the description as well, in case what I'm saying isn't deep enough. You can also find another source out there if you want to. So with that being said, like I said before, the first thing we're going to be covering is unique props and sort of how to get that out of your 3D software package into Unreal and apply a texture to it. So this is about as simple as it gets. This is just a very basic cart that I have right here. And just to show you, all the UVs are packed within the 0 to 1 space. Not perfect UVs, obviously, because we're missing quite a bit at the top here. But this is not a UV tutorial, so we're just going to sort of, not pay attention to that right now. So I have this cart. The only thing we're going to really have to do, and the only thing to really keep in mind, is the pivot. Wherever we want the pivot to be in Unreal, we sort of have to figure that out before we even export it. So the pivot is going to be in relation to the 0 space or the axis in your 3D software. So if I want my pivot point to be dead center at the bottom here, I'm just going to make sure that my pivot is centered, and then I am going to snap it to the lowest vertice, which happens to be this one here, and then just move this to the center of the grid. I'm holding X to snap it for you Maya users out there. Just going to freeze the transformations, delete the history, and now when we bring this into Unreal, our pivot point is going to be located right here. So I know sometimes if you're using a modular kit, you want it to be in the corner of something. If it's a prop, maybe in a different location. But specifically for this, I just sort of want to have it in the bottom middle, and something to keep in mind before we bring anything over into Unreal. So with this selected, I'm just going to hit File, Export Selection. I'm going to keep this in FBX. If we make it an OBJ, it's going to be rotated 90 degrees and it's going to be kind of sideways, so I try to keep it a FBX when I'm doing this kind of stuff. Not anything out of the ordinary going on here, so I'm just going to find a folder, models, and I'm just going to call this m_cart, M for model, just to sort of keep things organized a bit. So now that that's out of the way, back in Unreal, to import things, it's super simple. As far as this tutorial goes, I'm not going to go over a lot of the user interface, but I'm going to sort of be going a bit slower than normal and explaining everything I'm doing within the folders and whatnot. So I'm going to expect you guys to have a pretty basic understanding of, files up here, outliners over here. But either way, if you have any questions, feel free to let me know in the comments down below. So anyways, I made a folder here called meshes in the content just by right-clicking and hitting new folder. So let's go into there. From here, I can right-click and press import. And this is probably the easiest way to get our stuff into the engine. You can also drag and bring it in that way, but I'm just going to be doing it right-click import for simplicity reasons. So m_cart for mesh once again. and a bunch of different settings here. So just to keep this super simple, I'm just going to hit import. We'll be going over that a bit more with our next prop. And as you can see, we have our cart as well as a material that was brought along with it. Now, this isn't going to be something I'm going to be using. Personally, I want to organize my materials a little bit differently, so I'm going to be making a new one anyway, so I'm going to just get rid of that one completely. But as you can see, we can just drag this into the scene, and there's our cart. The pivot point is exactly where we set it up to be. And we can even jump into the game, and you know, it has collision by default. We can sort of interact with it. Very, very basic stuff going on here. So now let's get this material working on this thing. So as you saw before, it's already UV'd. I already have a texture prepared for it that I did in Substance Painter. So what I want to do is, I have another folder here. Once again, I'm just clicking content. And I made a couple folders here. Some are from the default layout. This is just the default first-person level that comes with Unreal, if you guys want to sort of just do that to follow along. But yeah, so I made a folder called Materials. I'm just going to right-click, and right here, New Material is the easiest way to bring up a new material. So I am just going to call this m_cart. Oh, that actually reminds me. Sorry, going back to meshes, this should be SM for static mesh. So static mesh _ cart. This is just for organizational purposes. You can import it as whatever you want, but this is just something I personally like to do. So now we can double click on this material that we made, and we're gonna get this new window here. It was just off screen for me, so I'm just dragging it in right now. Yep, so we're gonna get this, and it might look intimidating if it's your first time using it, but it is a pretty simple setup. As you can see, we just have this sort of final node here that we have to plug all of our different maps into. Of course, there's various settings on the side, such as if you want to make it a two-sided material. Say if you're making something like glass, you might want to change this to translucent, or if you just want to cut things out for a fence, like masked is pretty useful as well. But for this, we're just having a very, very standard material. So I'm going to put this off to the side, and we are going to go get some of our textures. So under textures here, I already made a folder called cart_on, and already brought in some of these materials. Once again, all I did was right click, hit import, and brought these in. So I have an albedo, a normal, and an RMA, which is a roughness, metallic, and ambient occlusion. So other than just simply right-clicking, there's one more thing that I usually recommend doing when bringing in your maps for your materials, and that's under your anything that's a mask, so ambient occlusion, specular, metallic, opacity, anything like that. If you double-click it, we can open up our actual map, and just to show you guys, like this is what it looks like with you know, just the individual maps, and it's just packed into one channel, right? So there's my roughness, my metallic, and my ambient occlusion. So it's just all packed into one map here. One of the things that you should probably be doing to make sure things are as accurate as possible is under compression settings. We can just click this drop down, go to masks, so no sRGB. It's going to make sure everything is truly black and white. It'll do a couple things, like as you can see now, sRGB is unchecked. A couple little things will be tweaked, and now everything's going to be a bit more accurate to the maps that we actually exported. If you don't do this, you might find things are a bit shinier. If you're using specular, it might be a bit rougher. Just some weird things that you probably don't want going on. I don't know why it doesn't do that by default. It can typically recognize normal maps, so I'm wondering if in the future it could recognize other maps. So we'll see how that goes, but all I'm going to do now is select my 3 maps, drag them in, and we're just going to plug them in. This is going to be super, super simple. So RGB is going to go to base color. This is, of course, our albedo, so our color. Same thing for normal map, so RGB to normal. And then once again, like I said, this is 3 maps in one. So our red is our roughness, our green is our metallic, and blue is ambient occlusion. So by plugging this in, our material is now complete. If you have a bunch of different maps representing the ones that are packed into here, very similar process. Just plug it in from RGB to your roughness or your metallic or your AO, whatever it is. I just prefer to pack it to save a lot of file size. And as you can see on the sphere here, we already have a pretty good preview of what we're working with. We can of course change this to like a cube or a plane or anything like that, but the default is a sphere. Just keep it nice and simple. And with that, I'm going to hit save. Sort of let that do its thing. I'm pretty sure these are all 4K. That's probably why it's a bit slower than it should be. But anyways, with that done, now we have in materials our cart material. So we can of course double click this to get back to it and edit it if we need to. But what I want to do is just simply drag it onto our cart. And as you can see, we have our material applied to the cart. All of our normals are working, our color, our different maps are all working properly. And that is probably the simplest way to do it. Now, the one thing I'm going to bring up is since I just dragged this on, if I go back to my meshes and I want to bring a cart out again, it's going to be gray. There's going to be actually no material assigned to it. So what I should probably be doing if I'm going to be using a lot of these is to double click on the cart here after selecting it, or going to my meshes and selecting it here. Either way works. And this is the actual settings for the individual prop. And what I can do is I can go over here to materials, type in cart, and now since this is saved to the actual prop, every single time I go over to my meshes and drag out a cart, it's going to have that material selected on it, which is super, super convenient. Obviously, sometimes you have multiple textures and stuff like that where you won't want to do that, but in a lot of cases, you're going to be reusing the same material on the same prop, and this is just going to save you quite a bit of time. There's a couple other cool things in here, such as you can find your collision settings. So simple collision, complex. Typically, all you have to do is adjust these sliders here and hit apply, and it'll do a pretty good job of setting up collision by default. You can check your UVs here as well. As you can see, it automatically generated some light map UVs, which I'll be going over in a little bit. You can check the wireframe, a bunch of stuff like that. But I think other than setting up this material, that's pretty much all we need to cover for this very first asset here. So we already got this in. That was pretty smooth, pretty simple, and yeah, that's pretty much how you're going to be setting up the majority of your assets. What I want to do now is sort of dive into buildings and things with multiple UV sets. So we're going to go back to Maya here, and let me just put this guy back over to the side, and we're going to focus on this piece here. So this is just sort of like a kind of a crude model of a like a building wall or something like that. So this will be like a brick material, and this is just sort of like a trim. I pictured maybe like a window going over top of it. So the way that I have this set up is if I turn on my material, I was using a trim sheet, and this is just a trim sheet I stacked together in like 5 minutes. It's nothing special at all. But pretty much the only reason I did this was to demonstrate how I would go about having a trim sheet as well as a 2 material asset imported into Unreal. So the bottom piece is utilizing this trim, and if I look at the UVs here, you can see that all these bottom parts are resting against this sort of tiling concrete material, and then the sort of big brick area is over top of everything, and that's why it sort of has these weird stripes going on. So obviously we don't want that to be happening in engine, right? So what I'm going to be doing is keeping this bottom part the way that it is, but since we want this to be a different material engine, we're just going to give it a different material in our editor. It's very simpler or similar to how you would go about doing this in, say, like if you were exporting to Substance Painter or something like that. If you want this to have 2 materials, you simply just apply 2 materials to it. So I'm going to select the entire area that I want the brick pattern to be on, and just give it a different material. Just for simplicity, I'm just going to give it a default red. And now that we have our 2 materials, this is going to break it up the way that we want to when we bring it into Unreal. So I think that's it. I think I covered it well. The one thing to keep in mind though with this before we move on is, as you can see, these UVs, even though they're following a trim, we do have some UVs that are outside the 0 to 1 space. And since we have that, we're going to have to make a unique light map UV, or we're going to have some weird sort of light build errors specifically in this area here. So I'm just going to let Unreal automatically generate that, but of course you can make your own light maps if you prefer to do that. But yeah, I'm just going to go over how to get some automatic light maps going on. So I'm pretty happy with where the pivot is, being exactly in the center of the scene. Is going to make it really, really easy to tile this stuff around. So now that it has two different materials on it, I'm going to hit File, Export Selection, just like before. Let's call this just SM_wall to keep it simple. And now we can just sort of kind of redo what we were doing before, but add a bit of different stuff going on to sort of add those 2 materials. So right click, import, I'm going to grab that wall piece. And this time we're going to take a bit of a look at what's going on here. So there's quite a bunch of stuff going on. So we can auto-generate our collision. Import textures. I don't want to import textures simply because the materials on there are not the final materials or anything like that. But there's a couple of other things in here, such as generating light maps. If I can find exactly where that is, import textures, material import, search location, miscellaneous. Nope. Nope. Oh, here we go. Under mesh, there's going to be a bunch of stuff that it's going to automatically generate. Generate light map UVs is one of them. So with that checked on, it'll automatically make those light map UVs. So even if you have stuff outside of the 0 to 1 space, it's going to automatically adjust and fix it up for you. So with that checked, I can hit import, and rest assured that everything is going to be working pretty good. So it appears it brought the materials with it regardless. I'm just going to delete those anyways. But yeah, now we have this wall piece, and as you can see now, we have two different materials because we set that up in Maya, and they're going to correspond with this brick area and this concrete area. So we can set that up pretty quickly. I'll just show you how that works. So I'm going to drag this guy out, rotate him around, just get him a bit closer to the cart for simplicity's sake. So I actually have some substance materials set up here, so I'm going to grab some bricks and drag this onto the top part. And as you can see, it does not affect the bottom part at all, which is super, super nice. And once again, we're going to make another material. So right click, materials. I'm just going to call this M_trim. And once again, we're just going to do the same thing. So I'm going to go back to textures, make a new folder, just call this trim, import, and I believe I have it under textures, trim, and once again, just 3 maps. So we'll be setting this up the exact same way as before. So select this, RMA, or any maps for that example that are grayscale, and just sort of go to masks. So as you can see, it's getting kind of simple and kind of repetitive, so we're going to be moving on quite a bit and doing some radically different stuff in the next step, that's for sure. So I'm just going to grab these, slap this in here, and just do a super quick setup. So color to color, normal to normal, then R, M, A. There we go. Give that a second to save. And if we go back to our materials, I can now drag that onto the bottom, and we have this second material. Obviously, it's not the most beautiful looking thing, but for demonstration purposes, it does a pretty good job. And once again, if we drag out another wall, as you can see, it's just going to be gray. So I'm going to actually go into the asset for this, put the trim on, put it on the first one, and then find where my brick material was from substance, and drag that right there. So now every time I bring out a wall, it's going to look just like this. And we automatically generated light map UVs, so we won't have any issues down here when it comes to building our lighting later on. So with that said, that's the very basics of bringing in assets, whether it be just a normal plain asset like this cart or something with trims, or anything like that. One thing I do want to comment on will be this sort of brick texture here. So I'm going to open that up here. So this is a material that's automatically made by Substance. As you can see, I have a plugin up here called Substance Source, or it's a plugin for Substance Source made by Algorithmic. But anyways, I'm going to show you how you can actually tile stuff super, super quickly. So say this is a material that you set up and you have everything plugged in, but you just sort of want these bricks to tile a little bit more. You think that maybe this isn't enough, or you want the wall to be a bit more dense or something like that. We can add a couple more nodes, and it's going to make this very, very simple to tile it like in real time as much as we want. So I'm going to right click, and I'm going to type in texture. Texture coordinate, that's what it is. Okay, so we want this texture coordinate node, and then we're going to hold M and click so we get a multiply node. And we can just sort of plug the texture coordinates into either A or B. And then we just sort of need a just a simple variable here. So I'm just pressing 1 and clicking, and we're getting a bunch of these variables. I just need 1, and I'm going to right click this guy, hit convert to parameter, and I'm just going to call this UV scale. So we can use this in something called a material instance. I'm going to show you that in just a second, but by plugging this in to B, now we have a controllable node that we can update the number in real time. We're just going to multiply the texture coordinate, which we are then going to plug into all of the UVs. So as you can see, everything is sort of going blank, and that's because by default the parameter is set to 0. I'm just going to set the new default to 1. You can set up a min and a max, but for something like this, it doesn't really matter all that much. I'm going to hit save. And as soon as that's done, we can close out. And as you can see, nothing's really changed. But that's because there's something really cool we can do. I'm going to right click this now and hit create material instance. So it's going to make another material. As you can notice that the normal material has a light green bar under it, and the material instance has a darker green. But if we drag this onto here now, we can actually double click this and we have sort of a different view here. So we can swap out materials here. This is a setup that Algorithmic did with their substance materials. But we also set up our own unique parameter here called UV scale. So if I enable this, I can start to scale how much these bricks are going up and down. And as you can see, it affects our actual model. So I'm just doing this off screen, but I'm going to set it back to 1 here. Say I want it to be twice as dense, I can set it to 2, and so on and so on. So that's how I would work with tiling materials to get the desired look I want. And obviously we're just adding like one tiny little node, so it's not very demanding or anything like that. So anytime you have a very large surface area in a tiling material, that's probably the best way to go about it. Once again, I'm just going to open that up. All it was just this here. We're taking the texture coordinates and multiplying it by our custom UV scalar. It's just one number that we're bringing up or down. If you don't want to do a material instance, you can of course change the number here as well. But that's completely up to you, however you want to do it. It's just way more convenient to change it really quickly here on a scalar parameter. So I'm going to close that all down, hit save. And we're going to start to dive into things that are a little bit more complex, but nothing too crazy. So one of the things I was asked to sort of go over super quickly was actually the landscape tools. This is going to be a very basic overview, and like I said, for everything so far and everything I'm going to talk about, I'm going to have way more documentation in the description below. This is probably going to be one of those areas where this is just the very basics. There's going to be a lot more information in the description. This is just going to be here to point you in the right direction. So if you're doing a lot larger of a scene, what you can do is hit this landscape icon, and you're going to have the ability to bring in a large terrain. So as you can see, I clicked it. I have a bunch of different settings here. The first thing I want to point out is if you are bringing in a landscape based on a height map, say you made it in, I don't know, World Creator or something like that, you can just do that and import it that way by clicking these 3 dots here. But we're just going to create new since we don't have any of that information right now. You can select the size of everything that you want, how dense you want it to be, and all of that. But for right now, I'm just going to hit create, and we can get to our basic tools here. So it's kind of similar to ZBrush in a lot of ways. We're just going to be sculpting. Just by clicking, we are going to be bringing up, and by holding shift, we're going to be bringing down. This is using the sculpt tool, of course. We have a smooth tool, flatten tool, ramp, erosion, hydro erosion, and a bunch of different other stuff to sort of mimic actual landscapes. Circle brush, we can use custom alphas if we'd like to sort of get more of a bumpy pattern, like using a cloud or something like that, or a generated clouds texture would probably be a pretty good idea for something like this if you're getting a more of a rocky landscape. Then we can also choose smooth, linear, spherical, however you want our finish to sort of be. But as you can see, yeah, just by clicking, we can, oh, that's smooth, my bad. By clicking, we can bring up, holding shift and clicking, we can bring down. Tool strength, brush size, fall off. Fall off is going to be how soft or how hard it's going to be. So if I turn the fall off to 0, it's very, very aggressive. While if I turn it all the way up, it's more of a pillowy bump. But yeah, you can sort of sculpt things and get some basic shapes. This is good for like background information. I'm going to turn the brush size down. And typically you want the strength to be a bit lower. It can get pretty crazy. Like if I turn this to max, you know, it doesn't take a lot to really get some aggressive shapes in there. But of course, one of the tools that's super useful is the smooth tool, just to sort of calm that all down a bit and blend it all together. So that's the basics of this. Of course, you have the paint tab, and this is something I'm not going to go too in depth into, because typically what you want to do is have a landscape material with a bunch of different materials that you can paint between. It's going to be similar options to the sculpting, but with the paintbrush and going between materials. So of course, holding shift is to erase, while clicking is going to be add. Same brush settings and all that, but to set it up is actually quite a bit more complex, so I'll have more resources for that in the description below. So if I click the actual landscape by going back to my place option, you can see there's a spot here for a landscape material, and these tend to be a lot heavier and a lot more complex. But by going back to my landscape, it would start to pop up around here with all the different options and whatnot. So with that out of the way, that's just the basics for landscapes. I want to show you a bit more as to how to set up some materials for your landscapes. And this is where we're going to start to get into things like vertex painting and vertex painting based on height. Now this stuff is super, super powerful. I'm going to open up a material I made for this tutorial. Now, if this is one of your first times entering Unreal, this might look pretty intimidating, but I assure you it's really not. It's more or less the exact same thing we set up before, just with two materials being blended together. This is the blending process, and this is the two materials on top of each other. We have our color, metal, normal, roughness, and AO. As you can see in this example, I don't actually have them packed into one channel for the maps. So of course you can actually just take it from RGB and plug it where you want to go. So I want to show you what this is and then show you how to make it. So I'm actually going to create a material instance just to make this a bit easier, and drag this onto our landscape. It's going to take a bit to compile since this is such a large area. Alright, so sorry about that, guys. What I wanted to originally do was actually just sort of paint using our vertices on here, but I realized that it wasn't dense enough to actually get a good result. So I'm going to be showing it over here using one of our basic primitive shapes, just a standard sphere actually. So sorry for the little hiccup there in the recording. I'm just going to bring the sphere over to where the rest of our props are and scaled up. And like I said, the reason we're going to be using a sphere for this is because vertex painting blends specifically based on how many vertices you have. So the more vertices a prop has, the smoother the transition of the paint is actually going to be. So typically something like this, where it's like legitimately just a plane, like let me just bring it up in Maya again, where it's one face, you wouldn't actually be able to paint on this. You'd have to sort of go in and add a couple edges to make sure this actually goes pretty smooth. So even though this technically isn't super correct when it comes to modeling, it might actually be necessary when you do bring it into Engine. So if you're planning on doing for like a big building or modeling for a big building and you want to have some vertex painting, you just got to keep that in mind, that this is probably the kind of workflow that you're going to have to go with. So yeah, sorry about that. So we're going to practice on the sphere here. I'm going to bring the material instance we just made and put it onto this sphere here. And now if we go over to our paint tool and bring our radius way down to like 50, maybe smaller. Let's bring it down to 10. You can see whenever I hover over this, the vertices are actually starting to light up. So it actually knows where they are. It shows you how dense it actually is. It gives you a pretty good idea right off the bat how well things are going to start blending. So as I showed in this material before, we have things blending between just a grass material and a more of a dirt material. So I'm just going to demonstrate that. So I can just paint directly on here and start to reveal that. And we have all these settings on the side to sort of make it a bit smoother or a bit harsher. So if I go to fall off and turn it to 0, it's going to be a lot harder. The reason it's not a completely straight line is because there isn't like a ton of vertices on this. But if we do turn it way up, you can see it definitely is quite a bit smoother. So we can sort of blend materials. This is really good for larger landscapes or way larger props or anything that's super modular like this. Of course, we can turn the strength up, turn that down, the radius, and all this stuff here, we'll get to that in a second. Essentially, we can switch between the paint color. So if we want click to bring things in, we can have white in the foreground, and then shift is going to get our erase color. But if we want to switch that around, we can just, you know, choose whichever is way more convenient for the specific piece that we're working on. Let's see. So yeah, earlier I showed you this. I'm going to quickly go through how we're going to make this. And to do so, I'm actually just going to go ahead and delete that and delete that and delete that. So I want to start this off just by having our materials lined up like this. If you're wondering how I got these comment boxes, it's just by selecting things and pressing C, and you get a box around them. This is just super helpful for much larger materials like this, where you actually, you know, things can get pretty hectic pretty quickly. So once again, just to make sure we're as clear as possible, I have albedo of one material and the albedo of another. Normal of one, or metal of one, metal of another, normal of one, normal of another. You can use as many of these maps as fit. Typically, this might be a bit overkill, but just so I can go over it multiple different times, I set it up this way in this tutorial. The only thing you have to keep in mind is that things remain in the same order. Like this is the part of the same material as this, which is part of the same material as this, and this, and this. So they all go together, and that's why they're all on top, and then the grass is always on the bottom here. So the first thing that we're going to do to keep this as simple as possible is do a little bit of a refresher from our last scene. So we're going to make a way to sort of tile this. Since this is typically something used on a much larger prop, we're going to want this to, you know, be tiled. It could be on a landscape, it could be on a building, it could be anything like that. So once again, I'm going to right click and type in texture, and we're going to try and get our texture coordinates. Texture. There we go. Texture coordinates. I'm going to hit M once again and get our multiply. And I'm going to hit 1 and click and get just our basic scalar parameter. So I'm going to convert this to a parameter by right clicking and pressing that and typing in UV tile grass. So I'm going to make this by default 1, just so it's the way it originally is. Plug that in. And this is a little bit different than before. So since we have two different materials, we can have them scale independently. So I'm going to select all of this. And a quick way to duplicate things around is when you have something selected, just press Control W. Interesting. I'm going to try that again. Control W. There we go. And it's just going to duplicate everything for you. So for this one, I'm going to change it to UV tile dirt. And we can use those comment boxes I showed you earlier just to keep it a bit more organized. So grass tile and dirt tile. There we go. So what we can do now is just plug it in appropriately. I'm just going to keep this a bit more organized. So our dirt, as I mentioned before, is on the top of everything. By the way, having these metal nodes that are just completely black is a bit overkill. You probably don't need to do that, but they're there anyways. So I'm just going to go ahead and plug these into the top of everything, like so. And same for the grass. So all the grass ones are going to tile the same way. So we're going to give them all the exact same UV coordinates. Just make sure everyone got one. Skipped over roughness. Yep. So we're pretty much done, except for the blending part. So I'm going to pull this back here to keep it a bit organized. As you can see, it can sort of get kind of crazy and spiderweb pretty quickly. But there's one last thing we have to do, and that is to lerp them together. So by pressing L and clicking, we can bring in something called a lerp node. And what this does is pretty much says whatever I plug into A and whatever I plug into B is going to be blended by whatever goes into alpha. And in this case, as you may have guessed, we're going to be blending our dirt material, which is going to go into A since this is always on the top, our grass material into B, which is always second, and we're going to plug that into our base color So we're going to be doing this for each one of these things, but we still need to be blending it with something. There still needs to be something that goes into the alpha. As you can see right now, it's just kind of like a half and half. So to blend it, we're going to be using something called Vertex Color. And this is where it all sort of ties together with the amount of vertices that's actually on your mesh. So I'm going to be just plugging in the red channel into the alpha. And what this essentially means is whenever I paint just the red information on a vertice, I'm going to be masking between either the dirt or the grass. I'm just going to be using one of these, and I'm going to place it probably in the middle. And we're going to be using this same node when we sort of blend everything together. So I'm going to get another one of these guys. Once again, we can click and press Control W to just get another one really quick. Metal's going to go from A and B, and our red's going to go into there. And we can plug this guy into metal. Obviously, this one isn't going to matter all that much, just because it's simply metal, and it's all black. But if it did have metallic, it would count. So I'm just showing it off for that reason. We can get another lerp by L, clicking, getting that in here, making sure everything goes into the same spot as the previous texture map. So bring that guy over to normal. Bring another one of these in. Roughness for A and B, and blending by that red. Plugging that guy into roughness, yep. And finally AO. So top, bottom, and our blend going into alpha. So I can now put that into AO. Keep this a bit more organized by commenting. Once again, hitting C. We can just call this lerps. And we can also just sort of drag them all together. This way it's way more convenient. And that's essentially it. That's our entire material set up. So if I hit save, and let that do its thing, materials can get pretty heavy the more stuff you have. Like as you saw, we just blended with only the red channel. We can of course add more materials, like blend between 3 things if we add a green, blend between 4 things if we add a blue, etc. And you can get some pretty complex materials. This is just about as simple as it gets, just blending 2 materials together. So I'm going to close this all out. Let me see, I'm going to get rid of this instance that we previously made. So this is the material that we just made. The vertex color information stays the same, so it's just working the way it was before, but just to sort of make sure it's all working fine, I'm going to bring in a new sphere, because yeah, the vertex information and the vertex color from the mask was saved from the previous sphere. I'm going to bring this guy on, and once again go to the paintbrush, and we can just paint between the stuff that we made. So that's essentially how you make that, and how you can blend between materials on your assets or your buildings or your landscape or whatever. But one thing I want to show you before we move on to the next thing is if we make a material instance, since we had this unique UV tiling for dirt and grass, let me just quickly paint maybe like an open area. I can now tile just by affecting these sliders here. I can tile just the dirt or just the grass. Because they're totally different maps, like they're unrelated, right? But they can both tile separately. So we can get something that looks a little bit more realistic. And, you know, it all depends on what we're going for, but this certainly looks a little bit better than this. And we certainly don't want them to be tiling the same. Like, for example, the dirt, I feel like needs to be tiled quite a bit more than the grass does. Like, that looks okay. The grass, maybe 1.5, but the dirt is currently sitting at a 2.5. So that, the way it is essentially how we can blend between materials, but we can of course take it even further. And this is going to be the most complex part of the tutorial. So if I open this up and you're a little bit sort of like, whoa, what is going on? Rest assured that we've covered 99% of this stuff already. So I'm going to open this up. This is a material I made based on the same stuff called a height-based vertex painting material. So it's just taking it one step further. So once again, we have our tiling going into our materials. There's a new thing called a transition phase that I added in here, and our lerps, but they're a little bit different. So I have a height lerp. So what's essentially happening here is everything's the same, but since we're using a height lerp, what we're doing is we're having our dirt go into one spot, our grass go into another. Our transition is still the vertex color we had before, but I'm plugging in a height map so that it actually knows how intense to blend in certain areas. Like if there's a rock sticking up, the grass will pop up underneath the rock before it goes over the rock when I'm painting. And then we can affect how much contrast there is just with a normal scalar parameter, and I plugged it all in. So what we can do actually to demonstrate this is we can just make a super simple version. I'm only going to use like 2 maps just to make this really quick. So once again, right click, go to material. I'm going to hit maybe M underscore brick grass, I guess. I don't know. I guess we can blend together some bricks and some grass since, well, we don't have a lot to work with here. So we'll just be doing that. So if I go to substance and go to bricks, I'm going to bring in, let's see, color, height, and normal. We're just going to use color and normal to blend. We do need the height of the background material though to base our blending off of. So I'm going to bring these guys in, bricks, this is our height, it's going to be in a different spot, and normals. And then let's find our grass. We can just sort of pretend it's like a moss in this example. And I'm just going to need the color and the normal. We don't need the height or anything like that from this because we're just going to be basing it off the height of the bricks. So just to keep it organized, I'm putting the grass normals under the brick normals and the grass color under the brick color. So we can quickly set up our texture coordinates once again by typing in texture coordinate, M for a multiply, just M and click, and 1 and click for a scalar. So I can right click, convert to parameter. We're going to call this guy right here a brick tile, give it a default value of 1, hook these guys up, plug it into the respective UV spots, and just sort of drag this guy back here. And then by selecting this, Control W to duplicate, and we're just going to call this guy moss tile. So I'm going to plug this guy into our makeshift moss. Keep it organized with a box, call it brick. Sorry, call it color and normal. And now we're going to introduce another new node here. So by right clicking, I can type in height, and we have something called a height lerp, very similar to the other lerp we were using. But like I said, we're going to be blending a few more things together. So we have our RGB going into A, our other RGB going into B. We're going to be blending based on another vertex color. We're just going to use a red once again. Our height is coming from the brick height. And for our contrast, once again, clicking 1 and clicking, and we can just call this contrast blend and give it a default value of 1. And just plug that guy into contrast. I'm going to bring the normals down a bit. But essentially we can plug that into base color. Control W to get another one of these guys. And just hook it all up again. So RGB, RGB, transition, height, contrast. And of course this means we can have different types of contrast or blend on different heights. But for something like this, we want it to be all uniform. Of course you can go through and comment all this stuff, but this is probably going to be fine. The material, of course, is only using color and normal, so it's not going to be totally accurate, but for demonstration purposes, this is probably Going to be perfectly fine. So if I move this to the side, let's get a fresh sphere in here. Bring this guy up in size. Go to our materials. Yep, brick grass. I'm going to create a material instance. We have those parameters at our disposal. And actually, let's start with that. Let's start by tiling these guys a bit. But you'll start to notice some pretty big differences once we start painting. So I'm going to start painting this away. I'm going to turn the strength down to 0.05. Like, this stuff gets pretty crazy pretty quickly. Maybe not that low. Maybe turn the radius up and the fall off down. Yeah, this is a good example. So let me just turn the strength down 0.075. Yep, so when I start to sort of paint things on, it's based on the height. You see how it's on the actual bricks before it goes into the cracks? Now this, of course, is the exact opposite of what we want. But it's definitely having a pretty big effect. And this is good for a lot of things you want to be overlaid, or you want things to act a little bit more natural. I'm keeping things out of the cracks, right? Of course, we'd rather have things in the cracks, and to fix that, I can go back here and sort of just invert this. All I'm gonna have to do is type in minus and grab a 1 minus node, plug this into there, and now plug this into our height. And essentially that does is just invert this right here. Hit save. We're gonna go through all this again, and boom. Sweet. So now you can see it's actually in the cracks, and we erase it, and it behaves the way that we actually want it to. So the moss would build up in the cracks before anything else, just like so. Obviously, this all depends on your height map, so this height map is pretty basic. It's pretty much just a, let's see, pretty much a map like this. Of course, if this was all white and this was all black, it would appear way, way, way more visibly stronger, but that would also affect how the actual height works, right? Like, we're still getting the desired effect this way. But I just wanted to make sure I showed you guys there's different ways of actually vertex blending. And if you want things to be a little bit more accurate, you can use the height blending version of things. And it gets some pretty cool results. Like, that looks obviously not the greatest super up close, but you can see it could lead to some pretty cool things if you're going for a more like overgrown, realistic sort of building style. So yeah, those are the two different ways that most vertex blending and vertex painting typically gets done. So the final thing I want to cover essentially for this tutorial is lighting, and this is going to be super, super quick. In this scene right now, we have a light source, which is a directional light here. Of course, we can just go over and grab things from our lighting area. So a directional light behaves exactly how you'd expect it to. We can rotate it, we can affect all these different things like the color, the intensity. It's pretty standard. It's a directional light. Point lights are exactly what you'd expect as well. Just a area light with a certain circumference, intensity. A quick way to get these into your scene, actually, since you're going to be using them quite a bit, is just by clicking L and click. Get those in there super, super quickly. Skylights are going to be sort of like an ambient background light, but the one thing to really keep in mind when doing engine work is building your lighting. So you're going to see this icon up here called build. I'm going to assume that most people can toy around with this stuff on their own. If not, I'll have a link in the description to the official Unreal documentation on it. But the one thing you want to keep in mind, and I think would be easier to explain in a video, would be building your lighting. So as you see right up here, lighting needs to be rebuilt on 74 unbuilt objects. Essentially that means that anytime something moves, the baked shadow information sort of changes. So the way that Unreal saves memories, rather than having all the shadows update in real time, some of them just get baked down for things that aren't going to move. Like if this cart never moved or nothing ever interacted with it, I wouldn't mind having this corner shadow stay the exact same on it the entire time, right? So typically you just hit build lighting, and it would sort of bake this lighting down to it based on the light map, and you're pretty much done. So I would keep this as a static mesh. It's not going to be moving anywhere. If I change it to movable, as you can see, this number decreased because now it's going to be updating the lighting in real time. I won't have to sort of affect anything based on a light map. The shadows will update every frame, but it's definitely way more demanding. So for most things, if you don't want it to start chugging, you're going to make it static. You're going to build your lighting down. You have all these different quality settings. Until you're pretty much done, you want to keep it on, you know, preview or medium. Production is definitely one of the last things you want to do because it can take quite a bit of time. But just to sort of show you, if I hit build, everything's essentially going to be baked down and this is going to go away. But as soon as I move something, it's going to come back. This is something that really comes down to personal preference. If you're making a scene just for looks, I would probably recommend baking things down. They're going to look a bit more accurate. You can have more bounce lights. But movable lights are definitely really good for when you have things in the scene that are obviously not static. They're going to be moving around. And as you can see, it's just sort of building right now. But when you select any kind of light, you're going to have your static, your stationary, and your movable. When it's movable, everything that it affects will not need to have a light map baked down. It's going to be all real-time shadow, but it does make it quite a bit more demanding. So typically only use those when you're covering something that's going to be moving around. Anything like a background prop like these boxes, if you know they're not going to be moving, feel free to just set it to static, and it's going to make it a lot easier for your machine to run. You might be wondering why there's giant previews everywhere. This is just previews of the shadows rather than the actual baked shadows themselves. So once this is done, the preview sign is going to go away. This warning is going to go away, and things are going to be looking much, much better overall. But yeah, that's one thing to keep in mind. When you actually build your lighting, that's your actual lighting and how it should be looking. Because the way things look when they're built and when they're unbuilt are pretty much night and day. So you should be building quite often when you do a lot of major changes, or every time you go up to take a break, just do a quick like low quality build or something like that to see if things are looking accurate. As you can see, the shadow is pretty fuzzy, but if I change the quality to like production, it would probably be a lot sharper. This is a very good example of that. This also is based on your light map resolution. I guess that's the last thing I could probably cover here is if I open up the prop and I type in light map resolution. Currently it's only 64 by 64 pixels. If you have a larger prop, you're going to want to increase that. But typically for most small things, like that's fine. Yeah, this is just where you'd find that sort of option. You'd have to save every time you change your light map resolution. Obviously, you're going to have to rebuild everything. So try and do these things together, or as many of these at the same time, so you're not, you know, wasting a ton of time or anything like that. But yeah, that's the basics of the lighting system. Like I said, I didn't want to go over each light and, you know, all the different settings. Like all this stuff is super self-explanatory and how it all works. But one of the things that isn't so self-explanatory is the building system. So yep, every time you move something that isn't set to movable, whether that be a light or a prop or something like that, you're going to have to build your lighting. Things are always going to look better after you build your lighting. So keep movable things to things that are, you know, actually moving. But other than that, I think that's kind of it. So in this video, we covered unique props, how to do assets with multiple texture sets, scalar UVs, blend multiple materials together, and just a basic overview of the lighting system. Once again, this is for a buddy of mine who just sort of wanted to get his foot in the door and understand Unreal a little bit more. So hopefully this points him in the right direction. And for those of you who are just starting to learn Unreal and the art side of it, hopefully this sort of introduces you to a lot of the things that you should probably expect moving forward. I know it's pretty basic, so for those of you who have a bit more advanced knowledge, this definitely it's probably not the tutorial for you, but either way, hopefully you guys learned something. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, hit the like button. I'm going to be making more videos soon, so look out for those. It probably won't be right away, but they're going to be coming again. I really did miss posting, so thank you everyone who made it this far into the video. Hopefully you did learn something. Once again, my name is Dylan, or Tie-Dye, and I'll catch you in the next video. Take care. See ya.